In today's episode, we'll discuss some of the best practices in implementing competency-based education, or CBME, in undergraduate medical education. Let's talk about holistic success. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Dore, co-founder and VP of Science and Innovation at Acuity Insights. Welcome to this episode of the Holistic Success Show. Here with me today is Dr. Zafar Iqbal, research scientist at Acuity Insights, and Matt Kay, enterprise account executives also at Acuity Insights. Dr. Iqbal is a research scientist at Acuity where he contributes to the development of test content and improving practices and procedures for our Casper situational judgment test. He has over 10 years of academic experience, primarily focused on the continuous improvement of assessment practices. His areas of research include the assessment practices, competency-based medical education, faculty development, and co-creation. Matt Kay, who's with us as well, has spent over 15 years working with so many schools, consulting and talking to them about implementing competency-based medical education into their assessment landscape. His work stretches the UME to GME continuum, where he's consulted both domestically and internationally around best practices and what works and barriers they might face. So welcome both Zafar and Matt.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks a lot.
It's so great to have you on the show today. There's so much wisdom in this room right now. We're really excited to dig deep into both your experiences and best practices in competency-based education. So let's start right away. In light of the finalization of the foundational competencies in the undergraduate medical education by the AAMC, ACOM, as well as ACGME that just happened in December of 2024, there's a move towards more standardization across U.S. MD/DO schools and the future of reporting incorporating these competencies in our data collection instruments starting in 2026-2027 cycle. So this topic is not only very timely and important, but is on the minds of a lot of med schools in the U.S. trying to think about how they're going to incorporate, what they're going to do, and what are the next steps. So first, Zafar, let's start with you. From your perspective as an expert in CBME, what are some of the typical barriers that undergraduate programs can face when they're implementing a competency-based education model?
Thank you so much. A great question. There are many challenges, but keeping the time limitation in mind, I'll try to focus only on those that probably are the most common. Some of the key challenges in implementing CBME, especially, and I'm focusing on the word especially because especially at the undergraduate level, are often related to the curriculum designing, assessment practices, faculty engagement, resource limitations, cultural shifts, and logistical hurdles. I know this is a lot to take in, so I'm going to expand on them one by one and very, very briefly. As far as the curriculum design is concerned, designing a CBME curriculum is very complex. Unlike traditional time based learning, CBME focuses on achieving specific outcomes, which is competencies in any competency framework. This requires very clearly defining competencies and mapping those competencies throughout the curriculum. Yes, there are multiple competency frameworks available to guide the programs, like you gave some examples, and there are some refreshers as well. But first of all, those frameworks are not universally applicable to all the programs. And second, tailoring these competency frameworks and using it superficially is another big problem. For example, having a competency framework does not solve the problem. Implementing it at the very micro level within the program is probably one of the biggest challenges. So it's not about having a competency framework, but having a very detailed integration of these competencies across the curriculum. That's my problem area number one. Second biggest concern or the biggest challenge that I see in CBME is assessment practices. So assessment differs significantly from traditional methods. In CBME, the focus of the assessment is on competencies over knowledge, continuous and frequent feedback, a mixture of using qualitative and quantitative measures to comprehensively evaluate learners' competence, and more importantly, developmental focus rather than one time performance evaluation. And finally, using multiple assessors to ensure fairness in evaluation. So as you can see that all these good elements, these elements make CBME assessment more comprehensive. but also more challenging to implement as these demand too much resources. Furthermore, high student to faculty ratios can impede personalized learning and competency assessment, keeping the workload of the clinical faculty, very busy people who are working in clinics and also teaching and supervising students. It's extremely difficult to provide individualized support in the clinical setting, which is very, very essential and probably a hallmark feature of CBME because it is very much linked to the development of the students' competencies gradually over the period of time when they're working in the clinics.
Zephyr, this sounds like a lot for programs to manage. What are some of the other implications there that we're seeing?
The issues that I just highlighted are more at the educational level, but there are some problems that are linked to the systems or the processes in place to execute the change. For example, faculty engagement and training. Engaging and preparing the faculty is another very crucial area. Many educators lack sufficient training or the familiarity with the CBME, how it works, what are the principles, and how to cater the issues if there are any. So faculty members need ongoing professional development and support to design the curriculum, align the assessment, and guide the students effectively throughout the training. More importantly, I think transitioning to CBME requires a significant cultural and systemic shift. Many institutes face resistance from the faculty as well as the students, which is very obvious from many publications or the research work that has been done on the implementation of the CBME.
Before we sort of summarize that, Matt, I want to turn to you because you've worked with a lot of programs as they've sort of said, okay, we're going to either dip our toes or jump right in, depending on the program, or at least start thinking about this. What have you seen in the many conversations that you've had working with UME programs? Are there other barriers that you've sort of heard and come across?
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. I have worked with a lot of schools and institutions looking to really incorporate CBME, and I think one of the biggest barriers that I usually see as they're starting off is that they want to build out a very complete and comprehensive CBME landscape, and that's not a bad goal. But what that means is they want to pick everything apart and completely redesign it. And I really think that the way to think about it here is that CBME is really meant to complement a continuous quality improvement environment. And so when you try to take the whole picture of what you want to do and move forward with implementing that, it actually can be a barrier to accomplishing your goals. And I think that speaks a little bit to what Zafar was saying in terms of a cultural impact. So the cultural aspect of it can be a very large barrier. And that's why it is important to kind of pick away at the little things that can work. Now, another thing that I see as a barrier is oftentimes a committee that gets together that is looking at implementing CBME kind of lives in a bubble, right? And they aren't really interacting with the other resources that they have available to them. A barrier there could be if you're not talking with your assessment vendor. You should really be engaging with your assessment vendor to understand, well, what are the tools that already exist so that you're not reinventing the wheel each time. Those types of things, and combined a lot with faculty development, are really going to be the things that drive towards success. But that main barrier there is trying to do too much at once.
That's great. I think it's great that, you both spoke to different factors and different barriers that they're seeing, but, at the end of the day, you spoke to the many different people involved in the change as well and needing to be aware of all of it. Sometimes we have this idealistic plan of what can happen, and we need to make sure as well that we're not taking an existing framework or an existing process that somebody else has used and trying to just apply it straight to our program without knowing the nuances of our faculty, our students, our resources, as you've both said. So I think that's great. Now, in this, we we started with all the barriers and problems, but people are doing this well. There are people who are implementing CBME and doing it really strongly. So, what would you suggest is a great starting point for some of these programs to troubleshoot the types of issues that you've identified in implementing competency-based medical education? Zafar, maybe we could start with you and sort of say, what have you seen, or how do you think programs could go about troubleshooting? Because it is a complex process to implement CBME. So how do they go about tackling it?
Thank you so much, Kelly. And I cannot agree with you more. You have put it very nicely that I see that many programs are probably forced by the leadership to implement CBME, or it's a decision that has been made, and now they are in a position where they have to navigate how to do it and how to find the solutions for the problems. So, keeping this point in mind, I'm going to address only on those factors that I think are manageable or that I highlighted in my previous point. I'm not going to go into the detail of the problems that are linked to the resources or the regulatory body problems or to the logistical requirements. So I'm going to focus more on how can we fix the curriculum, assessments, faculty engagement, and finally the institutional systemic change. So starting with curriculum design, I think designing a CBME curriculum is complex, but here's how we can approach it. I think first, it's very important that we involve the stakeholders early on to tailor the competency frameworks to fit your institutional vision and needs. Second, creating a clear competency map that aligns learning activities and assessment with your outcomes. That's extremely important. I think a comprehensive and carefully designed blueprint would play a key role in successful implementation of a new or a revised competency framework. Just a side note, I strongly believe that as a blueprint is a living document that grows and matures over the period of time. So please be patient with it, let it grow over the period of time, improve it, see what you have done right, and what are the areas of improvement. And I think instead of using courses, I think consider integrating modular design. These are often more flexible and adaptable according to the needs of the CBME. Now, moving on to the assessment practices, I think assessment in CBME is very resource intensive. As much as I'm a fan of CBME, I strongly believe that's a huge burden on faculty and to the institution itself. But there are some ways that you can mitigate this. For example, I recommend that programs thinking about CBME should use structured tools like rubrics to ensure consistency in evaluation, leveraging digital platforms to streamline frequent assessments and provide timely feedback, as feedback a constructive feedback is the essence of CBME. Train faculty in assessment methods to reduce the workload and develop better understanding of which tool should be used, when it should be used, how it should be used. And I just want to say that please always remember that the majority of the assessment conducted in CBME is assessment for learning and not assessment of learning. That should be a very clear cut discrimination between CBME and a traditional curriculum. In order to manage high student to faculty ratios, which is a severe problem in many institutions which recruit, for example, let's say 100 to 200 or 250 people students per year, I think institutes should consider implementing small group teaching methods or peer assisted learning approaches to reduce the faculty workload. Also, try to bring in adjunct or part time faculty just to fill the gap temporarily if that's a possibility. As far as the faculty engagement and the training goes, because I think this is a very, very important area. I think it's important that we engage the faculty right from the very beginning, offer regular workshops and mentorship programs focused on CBME principles, providing easy access to the online resources and the best practices from the curriculum design and assessment. And finally, my last point would be focused on the cultural and the systemic change, which is probably very important, but because I think CBME change follows a top to bottom approach rather than the other way around, because the change has to be brought from the top. And it is important that we conduct change management workshops and address the resistance from the faculty and the students, share why CBME is important, and bust some common myths that are usually associated with CBME. I don't want to go into the detail, but yeah, there are many, many myths around CBME, which is important to be broken down at this point of time, especially when CBME is probably now more than 2 decades old. And finally, my last point would be it's very important to share your success stories via pilot program and develop institutional policies that have a very strong alignment with your regulatory bodies.
Matt, maybe can I turn to you to sort of say, what have you seen or heard or engaged with programs to do to break down some of these barriers in the implementation of CBME?
So that's part of the reason why I was saying kind of break it out into modular things and look for those kind of quick wins. Now, when I look at the foundational competencies that have been released, I actually see a lot of alignment with how the GME functions within the milestone space. So, one thing that I think people need to really keep in mind here is that as you're planning on incorporating CBME, plan for change. It's going to continue to evolve, and you're going to continue to learn and adjust. Now, they also mentioned that they want you to incorporate at an institutional level the things that make you unique and what you're striving for as a medical school. So there is a lot of flexibility today in how you're able to incorporate the foundational competencies. And that can actually open up a lot of discussion, right? So that's where we're talking about that top down approach to make sure that you have all the things in place, especially faculty development, so that they understand the basic concept here that is the difference between a Likert scale and a Dreyfus model. That's another thing that I think people need to think about here is as you're trying to develop and design what your assessment landscape is going to look like, you need to define what success is going to be. And that means, well, what do you want? What do you want to define as success for the end of a first year medical student and a second year, third year, and fourth year? Each of those definitions of success is going to be different as they move through the program. And that's much more of like a Dreyfus model. And the reason that I bring this up is because this has been done by the GME side of things here for over a decade now since the next accreditation system. Most medical schools have GME counterparts. Don't reinvent the wheel. Go to your GME counterparts and ask them, what have you done? What have you found was successful? What are the pitfalls and mistakes that we should avoid? And then continue to keep in mind that as you plan this out, it's going to change and it's going to evolve. I think that means it's especially important to define what success is early on so that you now have something to measure as you implement an assessment landscape.
I think those are all great, very manageable pieces. And to when we embrace change from the very beginning and know that it doesn't have to look exactly like, the what we lay out at the beginning to the end, it is a little bit more reassuring. I think it makes it less overwhelming. I'd love to hear from both of you what the first few steps are that you'd recommend medical school leaders take into consideration in these new foundational competencies. Matt, I want to flip it and start with you this time and say, where would you do you think some of these medical school leaders could start?
There are a lot of really great resources out there, Kelly, and so I highly encourage anyone to leverage the resources that the AAMC has. But again, I think it's you don't have to reinvent the wheel on this, and I think that's where a lot of institutions get hung up first. Is how do we even get started? Again, those resources are very helpful, but talk to your friends and colleagues, especially on the GME side, because as I mentioned, I'm seeing a lot of alignment in these foundational competencies, and I expect these to evolve and change over time so that there is more alignment across the continuum of UME to GME. So I kind of stress that point. But again, those bite-sized chunks, implementing it maybe for a single course or for a trialed set of students, so that you can learn from your mistakes and learn what you want to actually achieve. Having that outcome and end goal in mind is very important, but your pathway of getting there can sometimes vary quite a bit. So those are a couple of things that I would look at. Again, also consult with any experts that you have on site. Of course, you've got faculty who are very expert and knowledgeable in this, so you can leverage them as help as well.
I love that, Matt. I think that's a great point. And really just sort of finding ways to, again, take steps that make sense for your program. Zafar, I want to turn it back to you to say, where do you think folks should start, starting with these foundational competencies?
So I think a great start would be don't panic. What I want to say essentially is the competencies are bound to evolve. I won't be surprised if there's a brand new framework 3 or 5 years down the lane. That's probably most likely because no matter how much ideal competencies you design, it's possible that they have some problems at the implementation level. So it takes a cycle or time to understand what are the implementation problems that institutes are facing and which competencies were easy to understand, easy to implement, and easy to translate in the training as well. Implementation is a whole different thing, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but what I'm trying to say is competencies evolve, so don't panic. I think a good start would be do a complete comprehensive review and align the new competencies with your current institutional vision and mission statement. and the competencies currently implemented. I completely agree with Matt here. Like he said, if you already have a competency framework implemented in your curriculum, it would be a great idea to start with a gap analysis. Assess your current curriculum, assess your current assessment practices, faculty expertise, and try to identify the gaps and prioritize the areas for improvement. My second suggestion would be host workshops to introduce the new competencies and provide strong professional development to ensure the faculty and the students are prepared for the transition. And my final suggestion would be, just like Matt said, start small. Implementation is usually very cumbersome, so implement small pilot programs. Once the new framework is implemented, gather input from all the stakeholders to test and refine the integration of the new competencies. And once you feel confident that you are having a success in the implementation, go large. Implement throughout the curriculum as you see fit.
Wonderful. Something I heard you both say so many times throughout this is, you know, feedback from all of those involved, and a lot of communication, even though we didn't sort of outwardly overly communicating the why are we doing this, the debunking of the myths, the how are we supporting you, the what are the things that are remaining the same. It's not all changing. Matt, as you said, maybe there's assessments that are staying the same. Maybe there's, Zephyr, as you were saying, there's in that gap analysis, there's still competencies that are staying the same. And there's things that relate to maybe their practices in their residency practice as well that they may have be able to take over. So communication, feedback, and taking steps. I think that's really going to help everybody get ready as they implement these new foundational competencies. Both of you, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. It was a great discussion. To all of you, thank you so much for watching and listening. If you haven't already subscribed to our show, please do so and share this episode with any colleagues who might find it useful. And with that, we'll catch you in the next episode.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Holistic Success Show, please be sure to check out our other episodes. We have episodes coming out regularly all the time, so please be sure to subscribe so that you can stay up to date on all things related to student and program success in higher education.